Hi guys, let's figure out how iPhone 7 Touch ID and home button circuit works today. Touch ID is a biometric fingerprint authentication technology. Fingerprint authentication and encryption of iPhone 7 are completed independently inside CPU. Each Touch ID sensor is designed to be uniquely paired with each CPU. With the help of the pressure-sensitive technology, the Touch ID of iPhone 7 and Return to Home function are tied together. If the Touch ID is not the one paired with the logic board, the Return to Home functionality will also be locked. First, let's take a look at main components on the Touch ID and Home button circuit. U1801, PMU. It is responsible for power supply of the circuit. U0700, CPU. It is responsible for overall control of the circuit. It also receives and processes Touch ID and home button data. U3702, Touch ID driver, boost IC. It converts PP_VCC_main into the 16 volts working voltage for Touch ID sensor. J3801, Touch ID and home button connector. It makes possible the connection between the Touch ID and home button and the logic board. It also provides working conditions for 3D touch function of the phone. Now let's find out how iPhone 7 Touch ID and home button circuit really works. To activate Touch ID and home button on the phone, the first thing we do is to make sure that the Touch ID and home button cable connected has not been replaced and is working normally. Once the phone has been turned on, PMU will provide 2 rails of power supply for the Touch ID and home key module. The 3 volts power supply and the 1.8 volts power supply. When the screen is on, PMU will also provide a rail of 1.8 volts power supply for the Touch ID and home key module, also known as PP_1V8_touch_Mamba_Connecticut. What's more, the 1.8 volts power supply is also the enable signal of Touch ID LDOIC. With the enable signal fulfilled, the Touch ID LDOIC will output a rail of 2.75 volts power supply for the Touch ID and home key module. CPU will then send a reset signal to the screen and the Touch ID and home key module. With the reset signal fulfilled, CPU will get the I2C bus started and identify the installed Touch ID and home button flex cable. With the help of the I2C bus, once CPU has confirmed that the flex cable is the paired one, the Touch ID and home button flex cable will get to work. When there is a finger pressing the Touch ID and home button, the Touch ID and home key module will send an interrupt signal to CPU, so as to inform CPU that there is home button function in need. Also, as the steel ring of the Touch ID and home button flex cable detects the finger, the Touch ID and home key module will send a boost enable signal to Touch ID driver, boost IC U3702. U3702 will form a rail of boost circuit with L3703, which will then generate a 16 volts working voltage to get the Touch ID sensor powered. Then, the Touch ID and home key module will send an interrupt signal to CPU, so as to inform CPU of the Touch ID data waiting to be transmitted. CPU will then communicate with the Touch ID and home button flex cable via SPI bus, so as to receive home button touch data and Touch ID information outputted from the cable. Please be noted that the Touch ID and home button flex cable is closely related to the screen. Abnormal condition of Mamba_2_LCM_ drive might result in not working of the Touch ID and home key module. Also, abnormal condition of the synchronization signal between the Touch ID and home button flex cable and the screen will result in failure of the 3D touch function of the screen. Now let's move to diagnosis and maintenance of the Touch ID and home button circuit. First, Confirm whether the Touch ID and home button flex cable connected is functioning, and whether the cable is paired with the phone. Otherwise, fingerprint recognition and home button function of the phone cannot be performed. If nothing goes wrong, try to replace the screen with a new one. If the solution doesn't work, check whether Touch ID and home button circuit relevant area is normal. If nothing goes wrong, run diode mode measurement of Touch ID and home button flex cable relevant pins on J3801 and J4502. If the measured value of one specific pin is abnormal, check relevant circuit of the pin. If the measured value of all pins is normal, with the screen on, and the Touch ID and home button flex cable connected, run voltage measurement of these test points. FL3801 1.8 volts, FL38033 volts, C38241 1.8 volts, C38232 2.75 volts. Meantime, with the Touch ID and home button being pressed by one finger, measure whether there is 16 volts voltage on TP0401. If there is abnormal voltage measured, check relevant trails of components that bear abnormal voltage. If nothing goes wrong, and the Touch ID and home button is still not working, then the fault is caused by pseudo-soldering or malfunction of CPU. Common fault components of the Touch ID and home button circuit. Damage of J3801 might result in issues like not working of the Touch ID and home button, add a fingerprint, option grayed out, or 3D touch failure of the phone. Damage of U3702 might result in Touch Idaho failure. U10, home button, turtle IC. The chip is soldered to the Touch ID and home button flex cable. Damage of the chip will cause not working of the home button. And this is our detailed explanation of how iPhone 7 Touch ID and home button circuit works. Feel free to visit our official website www.driwatechnology.com. See you next course.